Yo, what is going on, Comfy Gang? It's your boy Comfy Neat here. So for today's video, I thought I would kind of change things up since the last video was like 40 minutes long, and you guys are probably pretty tired of me talking about, stages of NEETdom. So instead of talking about, additional or optional stages of NEETdom, like I said I would last video, for this video instead, I'm going to be, talking about or discussing a sort of like more fun hypothetical, where I basically discuss the potential implications or impacts that World War III might have on NEETs around the world, as well as the NEET lifestyle in general. And for those of you who doubt that World War III is going to be a thing or it's going to happen, well, let me just remind you that I am a NEET who has spent several years in isolation, social isolation, who has had the time to engage in deep introspection as well as reflection on the state of humanity, market economies, geopolitical affairs, quantum physics, and social dynamics, and all sorts of other higher level, branches of philosophy, and as well as copious amounts of mental masturbation and shower thinking, which have basically granted me the powers of precognition, where I can see like maybe 8 to 10 years in the future with fairly good accuracy and, predict world events, frighteningly accurately, as well as, predict fluctuations in the stock market, as well as, the relative value of various bonds, stocks, commodities, cryptocurrency, and even predict things like weather patterns, wind speeds and cities, hundreds of miles away, maybe months from now, and I could pretty much get it right. But jokes aside, the reason why I think World War III might happen, there are like maybe two reasons for this. One being that history seems to be a bunch of repeating cycles. I forget the right term, it's like Hegelian, a swinging pendulum is another way of looking at it. But it seems to be roughly like a cycle where, future events or current events echo the past. And the only thing, the only difference between, current events and future events and past events is merely like, like magnitude, which is a consequence of, growing human populations and advances in technology, which will ultimately lead to, I guess, things happening on a larger scale, more devastation involved if there's war, for example. But at the same time, the same underlying sociological and psychological forces which govern and influence human behavior have remained fundamentally the same for the past, well, ever since the beginning of, humanity, when the first, Cro-Magnon human decided to bash another human, at the back of the head with a rock. And now we're fucking, might potentially have rail guns and focused laser weaponry and drone warfare and cyber attacks, but it's really all the same shit that's motivating human behavior. And so that's one reason. And the other, I guess, relating is that, well, every 50 to 100 years, there seems to be some sort of major global conflict that, ends up rewriting or shaping the world order, rewriting how map lines, boundaries are drawn, and how, which economies are functioning well and which are, are suffering at the hands of some sort of conflict. So yeah, and the last one which happened was World War II, which is essentially an extension of World War I. So you're looking at like maybe 80 years ago. So I think we're long overdue for that. But then again, I am an ignorant NEET after all. So I could be very well wrong about this. But regardless, since this isn't my area of expertise, and clearly the science and study of NEETology is, instead I'm going to be talking about the potential impacts, that World War III is going to have on, the NEET life, the comfy NEET life. So anyways, yeah, the first thing that I could see being affected would probably have to be cope acquisition. And by cope acquisition, I'm referring to the ability of NEETs to acquire goods, services, objects, paraphernalia that allow the NEET to maintain a state of comfiness. So obviously I'm referring to things like video games, for the most part, consumer electronics, and then after that, things like manga, anime, speaking for myself and the other weebs. And I guess if you're like an American person, then maybe you fucking like My Little Pony, fucking Funko Pops, you're like your Marvel comics, your Disney, I don't know what people like here, like stuff like that. And even things like if you have hobbies like musical instruments, workout equipment, if you like growing trees, then fucking fertilizer, all that stuff is going to get more expensive during a world war because as you guys probably already know, we live in an unprecedented time of just globalism and an entanglement of economies where as in the past, prior to World War One, it was like an entanglement of alliances, but now it's sort of like that being echoed, except instead of like political alliances, although that still kind of exists on some level nowadays, but it's more so now, market economies and countries relying on each other, first world countries relying on outsourcing production of goods and labor, outsourcing labor to third world countries, and then first world countries relying on other first world countries who I guess, I don't know if exploit is the right term, but I guess some of that, yeah, I guess exploit is part of it for sure, like exploiting other third world countries, but actually in a way relying on them for labor. And so relying on the third world countries that other first world countries rely on. So obviously it's just like a big web of interaction. And as a result, if there was some sort of global conflict, you could expect to see, the price of everything go up. For example, Taiwan, where I came from, all the semiconductors are essentially like 70% of, the semiconductor market share is controlled, by Taiwan, mostly TSMC and some other Taiwanese companies. I mean, I think it's like 80%, like 70 to 65%, by TSMC under any, given moment. And then you have Samsung in Korea, which controls like another 10 to 12%. And, I think another 10% is in China for like the lower end chips, as well as a few like higher end stuff, but probably not as much. But basically what I'm saying is that, if there was some sort of like world war, then, obviously China would, as basically stated, that they're going to take over Taiwan. And then afterwards, there's North Korea right next to China and right next to South Korea. So you could probably expect China to go North Korea into invading. So China could opportunistically, involve themselves in that conflict. But that's just my little, conspiracy theory, as to how, or I guess prediction as to how things will pan out, not to be taken with any sort of, legitimacy, because I'm full of shit and I don't know what I'm talking about. But so there's that, and that's just with consumer electronics, right? And then when you take into account oil, that's another thing which will increase the transport of goods and various goods. So that'll force countries to basically prioritize what is transported, and obviously what countries are going to prioritize is obviously food, water, essentials. So everything non-essential, like relating to hobbies, is going to increase in price, and that's not taking into account how various supply chains are going to be affected outside of oil. So as a result, you can expect food and everything to firstly go up in price, but even more so the things that aren't food to go up exponentially in price, like basically. So yeah, I think now would be probably a pretty good time to, at least if you have the money, although NEETs probably don't have the money, but if you somehow do have the money, if you're like a wagey watching this, then maybe no guarantee that it's going to happen, but if it does end up happening, then, at least you would have purchased some sort of like, I don't know, like a hard drive or something, anything that you need in the moment. Like, as much as graphics cards are kind of like overinflated right now, although they kind of are down at the moment, but, it's probably going to get way worse in the future. RAM, retro handhelds, computers, headphones, instruments, amps, anything hobby related. Like, I would, if you have the money, after obviously you cover, the essentials, like, I don't know, whatever to beat inflation, although I don't know what that would be, but yeah, just buy something that you think you might need to cope, because that stuff is going to get way more expensive. But yeah, obviously the point being that World War III will, increase the price of everything non-essential, which is essentially what NEETs, cope with. And the impact is that well, NEET life will be a lot less comfy, especially for NEETs who don't have the means to buy stuff, or who, let's say, who own equipment that is like several years old, and then it happens to conk out for like a several year long like global, military conflict, armed conflict, then, you're probably not going to have the means to replace that sort of stuff outside of stealing it. But I feel like most NEETs wouldn't resort to stealing, because I guess most NEETs aren't like, they're like too high inhib to actually do that kind of stuff. So as a result, NEET life is going to be a lot less comfy. So that's the first thing. The second thing is Tendy acquisition. And this isn't too dissimilar to, cope acquisition. In fact, it is another form of cope acquisition. The only distinction is that, well, I guess it has some specific effects. Firstly, that, weight loss might be one, potential unintended consequence of that. Difficulty of acquiring food, because, well, yeah, if you can't get food, then you're going to eat less and you're going to lose weight. So it might be like a blessing in disguise for some NEETs. For other NEETs, it might not change much. It might not change much, because there are a lot of NEETs out there who don't eat much to begin with due to things like depression, mental illness, or just being naturally skinny and having fast metabolism. So, things might not change at all as far as like weight loss goes. But that's one thing. Another aspect is the types of food available, because I know that a lot of NEETs out there, food is an important part of cultures around the world, and that includes the culture of NEETdom. And tendies obviously being, the poster child food of NEETs. And you can expect those crispy, juicy, succulent chicken tenders to increase in price tenfold. So yeah, you're probably not going to be able to buy that stuff as much. And for some NEETs out there, that might be soy fuel, that might be rope fuel, and that's completely understandable, because food is one of my personal favorite copes. And yeah, I eat a variety of things. Well, when I'm not eating instant noodles, I enjoy food for sure, and I even enjoy leftovers. But just fresh food, everything, the good shit, is probably going to be a lot far harder to find, far more expensive. So as a result, that might lead to a lot of mental health consequences for a lot of NEETs who are no longer able to cope with food. But if you are a NEET who predominantly consumes fast food, then it's my prediction or theory that, things might not change, at least for in the immediate future, or like at the start of the war, or like basically I feel like when rationing comes into place, I feel like governments and, will basically incentivize a lot of growing of the big three: wheat, soy, and corn. And, everything will essentially, when there's like a population that's starving, the easiest way to feed them would probably be through like fast food and all these shitty junk, like, shitty junk food, like highly processed food. So as a result, you could probably, see things like chicken nuggets and tenders and like fake, plant-based, fake food. And like all soy protein and like mashed up chicken carcasses with soy protein, fake chicken nuggets, which taste good, by the way, but are probably really shitty for your health. Pizza, government sanctioned fast food, rationed fast food, frozen fast food, canned foods, all this sort of like junk being pushed on, the population. So that might be the predominant diet for most people, assuming it gets really, really bad and supply chains are severely disrupted. So if it ever gets that bad, it might not, honestly. Hopefully it doesn't, but you never know. I'm just saying, hypothetically, if it does, then yeah, you can expect a lot of needs to rope, but for the needs that are used to eating fast food, then it honestly might not make that big of a difference up until the point where they start having to cut down on the amount of mashed up chicken carcasses in your chicken nuggies and then on your fake chicken tendies. And then afterwards, it'll start to taste shitty and shittier. Maybe they'll start pushing ground up mealworm protein, bug patties, and, because like for some of you guys who don't know, like the UN recently legalized or, passed, I don't know, whatever laws that now designate bugs as a viable or legal food source. And I'm sure that, the same thing is probably happening in a lot of other countries, if not already. So yeah, let's say if it gets to that point and now they're pushing bugs and stuff, eventually, the fast food is going to get so shitty and somehow depreciate in quality even more than it already has, due to shrinkflation over the past, several decades, that it's just going to become so shitty that people are just going to rope en masse, and that includes NEETs, because the food is so depressing. But then again, people might survive and adapt, and people will eat anything when they're hungry, so maybe it's not such a big deal, and nothing will really change except for the fact that we're being fed shittier food over time. But then that'll have trickle down consequences as far as like mental health goes, so, and physical health. So who knows? That's another thing that's going to be affected, tendy acquisition, and obviously that'll affect NEET life because, well, quality of food, as well as the fact that you're not going to be able to buy your favorite cope foods. So that's another thing. The third thing that will probably be affected is, work, specifically the fact that during times of war, NEETs might be forced to work, given that there's probably going to be a lot of austerity, a lot of, economic uncertainty, and, increased food prices, shortages of everything. In order to survive, support themselves, if not their family, I feel like a lot of NEETs out there, such as myself and many others, will most likely, I guess, be put into a position where, there's pretty much, I guess, no other choice but to work, if just to survive. Because if we can learn anything from the anime Welcome to the NHK, it's that one of the biggest things that will force a NEET out of their comfy based NEET den, for better or for worse, is the threat of starvation and homelessness. And the threat of that increases probably thousandfold, if not millionfold, during a massive world war, especially since it's going to be on a larger scale than anything we've seen potentially. So a lot of NEETs will be forced into, menial labor, because obviously we're not going to be working unless you're skilled somehow, you picked up some skill while you were NEET, then yeah, sure, maybe. But for someone like me, I'm probably going to be forced in some sort of like blue collar, like, shitty job, which I would have worked anyway had I been forced into a position where I had to like work to survive. So yeah, there's that. And if anything, it'll probably just happen prematurely during a world war. And if not, then who knows how bad it'll get. It might get to the point where governments are desperate for labor, and if somehow automation doesn't work out, although automation might invalidate everything I'm saying right now, but if it doesn't, then maybe like governments might even potentially force NEETs into the labor force, or heavily incentivize them, but maybe force them, like something akin to like what happened in World War II, and everybody will be forced to work in canneries and factories and, you know, cleaning and janitorial stuff and, you know, working in military facilities. But yeah, that's just another potential possible outcome for NEETs out there being forced in the workforce. And the final way, which I think that it'll affect NEETs, is the draft. And yeah, if you live in any sort of, you know, major superpower, like especially the United States, China, Russia, or anywhere in the EU, chances are that you'll probably be drafted, assuming it gets, if a world war actually happens and it gets really bad and it's full scale war. At some point, you probably will be drafted once the volunteer forces start to, I don't know, reach their limit as far as what they can accomplish. And as a result, yeah, you will be forced out of your comfy, neat life to, you know, basically fight for, you know, the powers that be. I'm not gonna mention, you know, which ones those are, because there are many theories as to what those are, and they could all be right. But I will say that, in my opinion, it's not worth it, and I feel like a lot of NEETs feel the same way. But regardless, you probably will be forced to fight for some, you know, some shitty person out there, and yeah, you'll be fighting some futile war that could have been avoided entirely in the first place, but, you know, it ended up happening because, you know, well, you know, people want to make money, and we're all just cogs in a machine to fulfill some agenda. So yeah, you'll fight some more. But for the NEETs out there, you know, given that there's a lot of NEETs that have autism diagnoses and are receiving disability bucks, and specifically autism bucks, perhaps those NEETs might actually be exempt from the draft, or at least, you know, have, you know, their drafting prolonged until the very last moment when their country might be in dire straits, and that's when they'll be drafted. But for every other NEET out there, if you're of fighting age, which is ages 18 to I think 30 or 40, which describes a large sizable portion of the NEET population, because I feel like there aren't many older NEETs out there because they're either eventually forced to work or just die of starvation or something, then yeah, I feel like a lot of NEETs out there might end up fighting. And, you know, that's obviously shitty because, you know, no NEET wants to fight a war. And like I was saying, yeah, like it's all just bullshit. It's like no matter what side you pick, like obviously everybody's going to have their allegiances. You know, I tend to lean more towards the West because I grew up in Taiwan, and, you know, I believe and I do fundamentally believe that the West is the better pick, but maybe that's because my interest financially, and maybe just because of how I was raised and, you know, taught to believe certain things, you know, it aligns with my interests more. But at the same time, if you kind of look at like how much better is the West than, you know, somewhere like quote unquote more like dystopian or more authoritarian, like the buzzwords out there, nations out there, it's hard to say because it seems like a lot of democracy is fundamentally an illusion, although maybe that's something someone who takes it for granted would say, but I don't think that's an entirely false statement. I think some of it is, you know, this ultimately just this bunch layers and layers of distractions and bullshit, when in reality the things that matter are all being controlled by you know, forces out there, people, you know, governments, corporations who ultimately view us as you know, tax cattle or potential voters or worker drones or people who they can mine and harvest data to sell to other companies for profit. Like we're all just expendable you know, cogs in a highly complicated machine, and maybe it is for the better, but I don't really think so. It doesn't really feel that way. But regardless, it feels like every nation out there, regardless of whether you live in China or the West, is all moving towards dystopia, as if it's, you know, a consequence not of, you know, countries fighting against each other, but purely because of, you know, a consequence of human nature, and you know, just a consequence of the expansion of the human population. And in order to manage that, that'll require increasingly authoritarian governments to manage resources. And I'm not saying that's right. I'm saying that's really shitty, but and maybe that's just the way it's always been, that we've all been living in some sort of like authoritarian dystopia. But now, now that it's getting expensive to maintain the illusions of freedom and choice and all those sorts of things. Although I do think that people nowadays have some level of freedom that's unprecedented in human history, but I feel like that will be slowly stripped away and we will return to our sort of like the old days, basically, where, we're basically essentially serfs living under the rule of oligarchs or the ruling class. And I think regardless of whatever country you hail from, some countries have gotten to experience this earlier or than others, and for some it never went away. But I think so far the future seems pretty bleak, and that's a black pill, but probably one of the bigger black pills out there, because ultimately nobody wants to fight these stupid wars. And I know, a hot take, right? Like, obviously, like, it's not a brave thing to say, but I don't know what I'm fucking saying at this point. Like, I'm probably rambling. Regardless, and I guess the final outcome is that, if you're living in a country like Canada or a smaller country out there that is uninvolved in all this shit, then maybe your NEET there and your NEET life will remain largely unchanged. Maybe, the prices of things will increase somewhat, but you'll still be able to afford at least food and commodities, and your electronics will be fine. You won't be forced to work or into the draft, which is probably the most catastrophic consequence that any NEET out there could experience. So if you're lucky enough to maybe live in one of these countries where you're not really impacted by war, like Canada, which is basically just some like massive buffer state that virtue signals by sending volunteer troops occasionally to random battlefields, but in reality does jack shit, which is good. If you live there, then yeah, maybe you will sit through World War III entirely unfazed, not having to do anything, and you'll get to live your company life. Hopefully it ends up that way for most NEETs out there, but it's really hard to say at this point. And to be frank, it's not looking too great out there. But then again, I am an ignorant NEET and I know jack shit. So hopefully I'm wrong about everything, and this is all just the ramblings of a borderline schizo ignorant NEET, and hopefully I'm wrong about everything, and World War III doesn't actually happen, and we all get to live our lives, and NEETs continue to stay based and comfy in their NEET dens. But that's pretty much all I have to say on this topic. So hopefully you guys found this video entertaining and got something out of it. And this is Company signing out, and peace.